Medieval Europe, stretching roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century, was a world profoundly different from the society we know today. It was a time when religion dictated moral values, kings ruled by divine right, and social hierarchies were rigidly enforced. Life for most people revolved around survival, social obligation, and the preservation of family honor. Within this framework, marriage was not a matter of personal choice or romantic attachment. It was a strategic tool, a contract that served economic, political, and social purposes. Understanding the social fabric of medieval Europe is essential to grasping why adultery, especially by women, was perceived as a crime far more serious than it might seem today. In medieval society, hierarchy and status were everything. The nobility, clergy, and emerging merchant classes each operated under strict codes of behavior. The nobility's marriages were carefully orchestrated to consolidate wealth, land, or political influence. Marrying into a powerful family could elevate one's social standing or secure valuable alliances, while marrying poorly could result in social ostracization or even political vulnerability. Peasants and lower-class citizens had less control over their marital choices, but marriage was still a practical necessity. Unions were often arranged to combine land, labor, and resources in ways that ensured survival. Across all social strata, marriage was viewed less as a personal, emotional bond and more as a legal and social contract. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of society's strict expectations. In the eyes of medieval law and custom, women were considered the property of their fathers until marriage, and afterward the property of their husbands. Their value was often measured by their ability to bear children, manage a household, and uphold family honor. A woman's virtue and fidelity were not just personal concerns. They reflected directly on the honor of her family and, for noble women, even the integrity of political alliances. For this reason, a wife's behavior was scrutinized constantly. Gossip, rumors, and suspicions were enough to tarnish a woman's reputation, and the consequences of stepping outside societal norms could be severe, even lethal. The Church played a central role in shaping the moral and social codes of medieval Europe. Christianity was more than a religion. It was the foundation of law, education, and public life. Church teachings emphasized chastity, fidelity, and obedience for women, and adultery was framed not just as a sin, but as a crime against God, the husband, and society. The Church's influence extended to every village and castle, with priests and bishops acting as moral authorities whose judgment carried both spiritual and temporal weight. By codifying marital fidelity as a moral obligation, the Church reinforced social hierarchies and legitimized harsh punishments for those who strayed from accepted norms. In addition to religious influence, economic and social considerations further complicated marriage and fidelity. A man's heirs had to be legitimate. Inheritance disputes could destabilize families and, in noble circles, entire regions. A wife's fidelity was crucial to ensure that the children she bore were indeed her husband's, preserving the family line and protecting property rights. The fear of illegitimate heirs was not a theoretical concern. It could lead to the loss of lands, titles, or even the family's social standing. This created a climate of suspicion, surveillance, and strict control over women, particularly within noble households where the stakes were highest. The daily life of medieval women, especially married women, was marked by strict routines and limited autonomy. Household management was a complex responsibility, including everything from preparing food, tending gardens, supervising servants, spinning and weaving textiles, and raising children. In rural areas, women also worked alongside men in the fields, yet their labor was rarely considered equal in social or economic terms. Even in the relatively more autonomous lives of lower-class women, the social expectation of obedience to fathers, husbands, and church authorities remained inescapable. The contrast between physical labor and social control underscores the paradox of medieval womanhood. Women were indispensable to survival, yet subjected to strict moral and legal regulation. Public perception and reputation were critical components of the social fabric. Medieval communities were tightly knit, and social surveillance was constant. A rumor of a wife's infidelity could spread quickly, fueled by neighbors, servants, and even family members. In a world where literacy was limited, oral accounts, gossip, and local tradition served as the primary means of communicating moral norms. A woman accused of adultery risked not only punishment from her husband or the law, but also social ostracization and permanent damage to her family's reputation. The threat of humiliation was a powerful tool to enforce conformity, reflecting a society that prized honor above individual rights or personal happiness. It is also important to recognize the regional variations within medieval Europe. Laws, customs, and the severity of punishments differed between kingdoms, duchies, and even villages. For example, in some regions, noble women accused of adultery faced imprisonment or loss of property, while in others, corporal punishment or even execution was possible. In peasant communities, the consequences might include public shaming, financial penalties, or banishment. Despite these differences, one constant remained: a woman's fidelity was a matter of public concern, and transgressions were treated as both a moral and social offense. The rigid social fabric of medieval Europe created a world in which control over women's bodies and behavior was considered essential to the maintenance of order. Marriage was a transactional institution. Women's virtue was a measure of family honor, and the threat of social or legal punishment ensured compliance. Adultery was not merely a private betrayal, but a violation of the social contract, capable of undermining property rights, political alliances, and the very moral fabric of society. This background is critical to understanding why the punishments for cheating wives were not only harsh, but often horrifying by modern standards. They were designed to enforce obedience, preserve family honor, and deter others from similar transgressions. In summary, the social structure of medieval Europe was a complex web of hierarchy, obligation, and control. Women were expected to navigate this web with caution, maintaining virtue and obedience at all costs. Their marriages were strategic instruments, their behavior under constant scrutiny, and their reputation closely tied to the fortunes of their families. It was a society in which individual desires were secondary to social expectation, and any deviation, particularly adultery, was met with suspicion, condemnation, and often brutal punishment. Understanding this intricate social fabric allows us to appreciate why the fate of cheating wives in medieval Europe was far grimmer than contemporary sensibilities might imagine. In medieval Europe, the distinction between secular law and religious edict was often blurred, creating a unique legal landscape in which morality and legality were deeply intertwined. Understanding this dual system is crucial to comprehending the harsh punishments meted out to adulterous wives. The medieval legal framework was not simply a set of written statutes. It was a living, complex system shaped by tradition, religious doctrine, local customs, and the authority of rulers and the church. Within this framework, adultery was considered both a sin and a crime, punishable not only by civil authorities, but also by spiritual oversight. The church's influence on moral and legal codes in medieval Europe cannot be overstated. Christianity was the bedrock of societal values, and canon law, the church's own legal system, regulated virtually every aspect of daily life. Canon law treated adultery as a grave sin, one that threatened not only the sanctity of marriage, but also the moral order of society. The Church's teachings emphasized fidelity as a moral imperative, framing sexual misconduct as a violation of divine law. Clergy often acted as both moral guides and judicial authorities, determining the severity of punishment based on the circumstances of each case. Unlike modern courts, where the focus is on legal evidence and due process, medieval tribunals often prioritized moral judgment and communal norms. Secular laws, meanwhile, reflected a pragmatic concern for property, inheritance, and family honor. Feudal lords and monarchs established legal codes to maintain social order, protect the integrity of noble lineages, and prevent disputes over property or heirs. In many cases, the consequences of adultery were as much about safeguarding economic and political interests as they were about punishing moral transgression. For example, in noble families, a wife's adultery could cast doubt on the legitimacy of her children, threatening inheritance rights and destabilizing alliances forged through marriage. This practical concern magnified the perceived severity of the offense, especially among the upper classes. The interaction between church and secular law was complex and varied across regions. In some areas, ecclesiastical courts took precedence in cases of adultery, particularly when the offender was a member of the nobility or the clergy. These courts often prioritized confession, penance, and restitution over purely punitive measures. However, when adultery intersected with matters of property, inheritance, or social reputation, secular courts could intervene, imposing fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. In certain jurisdictions, a husband could even obtain permission to exact personal vengeance, a practice that often resulted in severe physical punishments for the offending wife. The coexistence of these two legal spheres created an environment in which moral judgment and legal consequence were deeply intertwined, ensuring that the repercussions for adultery were both multifaceted and severe. Religious and secular laws also codified a stark gender disparity. Men accused of adultery often faced less stringent consequences, reflecting societal attitudes that viewed male sexual activity as natural or excusable. Women, however, were considered guardians of family honor and lineage. Their fidelity was tied to social stability. This double standard was reinforced by both canon law and secular statutes, which frequently prescribed harsher penalties for female offenders. For instance, some legal codes allowed husbands to physically punish their wives or even seek execution in extreme cases, whereas men might face only financial penalties or social admonishment. The combination of religious and secular oversight ensured that women bore the brunt of society's efforts to regulate sexual behavior. The Church's moral influence extended beyond formal courts. Confession and penance were essential components of the ecclesiastical response to adultery. Women accused of infidelity were often required to publicly confess their sins and perform acts of penance, such as fasting, pilgrimage, or public humiliation. These acts were intended not only to cleanse the sinner spiritually, but also to serve as a warning to the community. In many towns and villages, the fear of public shaming was nearly as powerful as the threat of corporal punishment. Pillories, stocks, and public processions were tools of moral enforcement, ensuring that a woman's transgression became a spectacle that reinforced social norms. In addition to formal legal and religious frameworks, customary law played a significant role in determining consequences for adultery. Local customs, passed down orally through generations, often dictated how a community responded to moral transgressions. In some areas, women could be banished, fined, or even physically harmed based on local tradition rather than codified law. These customs could vary dramatically between regions, reflecting differences in social priorities, economic pressures, and communal values. Nevertheless, the underlying principle was consistent. Female fidelity was a matter of communal concern, and any violation of this expectation demanded correction or punishment. Punishments for adultery often reflected a combination of practical, moral, and social considerations. Physical punishment, such as flogging or mutilation, served as a deterrent and a means of reasserting male authority. Financial penalties compensated the husband or family for the dishonor or potential loss of property. Public shaming reinforced social norms and served as a cautionary spectacle for the wider community. In extreme cases, particularly in noble families or regions with harsh customary laws, women accused of adultery faced execution. These punishments illustrate the dual purpose of medieval justice: to correct the individual's behavior and to reinforce the social order. The severity of punishment also depended on the social status of the parties involved. Noblewomen were under intense scrutiny because their actions could have far-reaching political and economic consequences. Peasant women, while not involved in high-stakes alliances, were still subject to communal surveillance and could be punished harshly for violating norms. The widespread belief that women's fidelity was crucial to social stability ensured that punishment for adultery was a matter of public concern, regardless of class. Religious teachings reinforced these legal frameworks with vivid moral rhetoric. Sermons, religious texts, and church councils warned of the spiritual and temporal consequences of adultery. Women were reminded that infidelity could endanger their souls, tarnish family honor, and provoke divine retribution. The fear of eternal damnation, combined with the tangible punishments imposed by secular authorities, created a climate of intense social control. Even the threat of accusation could have devastating effects, as rumors and suspicion often carried consequences comparable to formal charges. In conclusion, the laws, religion, and moral codes of medieval Europe created a society in which adultery, particularly by women, was viewed as both a moral failing and a legal offense. Canon law, secular statutes, and customary practices combined to enforce strict standards of behavior, ensuring that women were held accountable not only to their husbands, but to the wider community and to God. The dual system of ecclesiastical and secular oversight, coupled with deeply ingrained social norms, meant that the consequences of infidelity could be severe, humiliating, and even fatal. This framework set the stage for the extreme punishments and public shaming that would later define the fate of cheating wives in medieval Europe, revealing a world in which morality, law, and social order were inseparable, and in which women paid the heaviest price for transgressions of sexual and marital norms in medieval Europe. The consequences for adultery were not applied equally. Gender was a defining factor in how society responded to sexual transgressions, and the contrast between punishments for men and women reveals much about the social and moral priorities of the time. While both male and female adulterers could be condemned by law and subjected to public humiliation, women almost invariably faced far harsher and more enduring consequences. To fully understand the grim reality for women, it is necessary to examine the double standards, the underlying societal beliefs, and the specific punishments that distinguished male and female offenders. From the outset, the social position of men and women shaped expectations of sexual behavior. Men were often perceived as naturally lustful, and their infidelities were sometimes tolerated, especially among the nobility. Affairs conducted by men were often viewed as lapses in self-control rather than as crimes against family or society. Husbands who cheated might be publicly criticized or socially admonished, but they rarely faced the kind of corporal or life-threatening punishments meted out to women. In contrast, a woman's fidelity was directly linked to family honor, property inheritance, and social stability. Her sexual behavior was tightly policed, and her transgressions were seen as deliberate. Betrayals that jeopardized not only her husband's line, but the moral fabric of the community. The severity of punishments for women reflected this perspective. In the case of a woman accused of adultery, consequences could range from public shaming and corporal punishment to imprisonment, mutilation, or even execution. Stocks and pillories were common tools of humiliation, exposing women to ridicule, verbal abuse, and sometimes physical assault by townspeople. In some regions, women were forced to wear symbols of their infidelity, such as a scarlet letter or a placard describing their crime, for extended periods. These measures were intended not only to punish the woman, but to warn the community of the consequences of violating social and moral norms. The emphasis on public shaming highlights how adultery was considered a communal concern, with the female body serving as a site for the enforcement of social control. By contrast, men's punishments were typically less public and less severe. A male adulterer might be fined, required to provide restitution to the husband of the woman involved, or subjected to a brief period of ecclesiastical penance. Physical punishments were comparatively rare, and life-threatening consequences were almost unheard of for men of status. This disparity reveals the deeply ingrained patriarchal assumption that men's sexual activity was natural and somewhat excusable, whereas women's sexuality was tightly controlled and morally scrutinized. In essence, the law and custom treated men as active agents whose desires were difficult to restrain, while women were viewed as dangerous if they strayed from their prescribed roles. The underlying reasoning for this double standard was largely tied to inheritance and property. In noble families, the legitimacy of heirs was paramount. A wife's adultery could cast doubt on the paternity of her child. Threatening the inheritance of land, titles, and wealth. A husband's fidelity, however, was less critical to the family line. The potential consequences of female infidelity were therefore considered more severe because they could destabilize the entire family structure and, by extension, the social and political order. This practical concern was reinforced by religious teachings that framed women as morally weaker and in need of stricter guidance, thereby justifying harsher punishments. Punishments also varied depending on social class. Noble women were closely monitored, and any infidelity could result in swift and dramatic consequences. In some cases, aristocratic women accused of adultery were confined to convents, often for life, or subjected to brutal physical punishment, such as whipping or mutilation. For lower-class women, punishments might include public flogging, banishment, or financial penalties, but the social stigma could be equally devastating. Even when the legal consequences were less severe, the loss of reputation often led to lifelong marginalization, limiting marriage prospects and social mobility. The punishment of women was therefore both physical and symbolic, reinforcing social hierarchies and moral norms. The role of the Church further amplified this gender disparity. Ecclesiastical courts often required women to confess their sins publicly and perform acts of penance designed to humiliate and morally correct. Pilgrimages, fasting, and public penance were common requirements, and failure to comply could result in additional punishment or excommunication. Men, while also subject to ecclesiastical oversight, were rarely required to undergo such public or morally shaming rituals for the same offense. These practices reflect a broader worldview in which women's bodies and behavior were considered central to moral order, while men's actions were interpreted as less threatening or inherently manageable. Physical punishments for women could be extraordinarily severe. In some regions, adulterous women were subjected to mutilation, including the cutting of noses or ears, branding, or other forms of corporal punishment intended to permanently mark their crime. Public executions, while less common, were also a reality in extreme cases, particularly among noble families or under strict local customs. Methods included drowning, burning, or hanging, often carried out with the explicit purpose of deterring other women from similar behavior. These punishments combined physical pain, humiliation, and the destruction of social status, underscoring the severity with which female adultery was treated. By contrast, male offenders rarely faced such drastic measures. A man's transgression might provoke anger, ridicule, or a fine, but his life, health, and social standing were rarely endangered in the same way. This disparity was justified by prevailing notions of male authority and female subordination. Men were expected to assert dominance in public and private spheres, and their infidelities were often interpreted as natural expressions of that dominance. Women, however, were seen as moral guardians, whose fidelity was a reflection of the family's integrity and the community's well-being. Consequently, the punishment of women was as much about reinforcing social hierarchies as it was about addressing the act of adultery itself. The contrast between male and female punishment also had a psychological dimension. The public shaming, corporal punishment, and threats of execution created a climate of fear for women, ensuring compliance with societal expectations. For men, the relative leniency reinforced their social power and sexual autonomy. In effect, the legal and social systems worked together to maintain patriarchy. Control, using punishment as a tool to regulate women's bodies and behavior while permitting men a degree of sexual and social freedom. In conclusion, the punishments for men and women in medieval Europe reflect a stark gender disparity rooted in social, economic, and religious priorities. Women bore the brunt of societal control, with adultery punished through humiliation, corporal punishment, and sometimes death. Men, in contrast, were rarely subjected to equally severe consequences. This double standard underscores the patriarchal logic of medieval society. Women's fidelity was essential to family honor and social order, while men's transgressions were considered less threatening and more excusable. Understanding this imbalance is key to appreciating just how grim the fate of adulterous wives could be, a fate that was not only legal and physical, but deeply social and moral, leaving lasting scars on both body and reputation. The disparity between male and female punishment in medieval Europe illustrates a society where gender dictated justice and morality, where women were made to bear the consequences of a system that valued family honor and social stability above individual rights, and where the consequences of perceived sexual transgression could be horrifyingly severe. These realities set the stage for the extreme punishments and societal shaming that will be explored in the next section, demonstrating that for medieval women, the stakes of adultery were far higher than for men, and the consequences often far worse than modern imagination can fathom. In medieval Europe, the consequences of female adultery were rarely confined to private homes or whispered rumors. Instead, punishment was deliberately public, designed to humiliate the offender, warn the community, and reinforce social norms. Public shaming and torture were two of the most common methods employed to enforce the rigid moral and social codes of the time. These practices were deeply intertwined with the values of honor, community surveillance, and patriarchal authority, creating a system in which the violation of marital fidelity was treated as a spectacle of correction, as much as a legal or moral issue. Public shaming took many forms, from stocks and pillories to processions through towns and villages. Stocks were wooden devices in which a woman's hands and sometimes feet were locked, forcing her to stand in a public space for hours or days. Passers-by jeered, mocked, or even hurled objects at the condemned woman. Pillories, similar devices, often exposed a person's head and hands, ensuring that the humiliation was visible to the widest possible audience. These punishments were not merely punitive, they were performative, turning the offender into a living cautionary tale. The community participated in the punishment, reinforcing social cohesion by collectively condemning the transgression. Processions were another form of public humiliation, particularly for noble women or women accused of high-profile adultery. Offenders were often paraded through streets, sometimes wearing signs or garb marking their offense, such as a red sash or placard stating adulteress. These processions could involve the offender being led to a church or court for public confession, penance, or sentencing. The purpose was multifold: to shame the individual, to demonstrate the authority of law or church, and to communicate the moral consequences of adultery to the broader community. In essence, public shaming was both punishment and pedagogy, teaching others the cost of violating social norms. Corporal punishment was frequently combined with public humiliation. Women accused of adultery could be whipped, beaten, or subjected to other forms of physical pain in a public setting. Flogging was a common punishment, with the number of lashes determined by the severity of the offense, social status, or local custom. In some regions, women were branded with a mark of their sin or subjected to mutilation, such as having a hand cut off or their nose or ears removed. These punishments were intended to be permanent reminders of the crime, physically inscribing the offense onto the body of the woman and leaving her visible to the community as a living warning. Torture, while more commonly associated with criminal or heretical cases, was also employed against women accused of adultery, particularly when the accusation involved nobility or high stakes, such as questions of inheritance. Torture served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, it was sometimes used to extract confessions, especially when evidence was scarce or when a powerful family demanded certainty regarding the woman's guilt. Symbolically, torture reinforced the authority of law and moral order, demonstrating that transgressions against marital fidelity could have severe and uncompromising consequences. The methods varied widely, from stretching devices and iron shackles to burning with hot irons or immersion in water, depending on the period, region, and status of the offender. In addition to physical punishment, public shaming often included rituals of moral correction dictated by the church. Ecclesiastical authorities required women to perform penance in highly visible ways, such as walking barefoot through the streets, carrying heavy crosses, or attending Mass while publicly confessing their sins. These rituals were intended to purify the soul while simultaneously signaling to the community that justice had been served. For many women, the combination of physical suffering and moral humiliation was psychologically devastating, leaving deep emotional scars alongside the physical injuries inflicted during punishment. Community involvement was a key feature of these punishments. Villagers were often encouraged, or at least permitted, to participate in the offender's humiliation. Stones, mud, rotten food, or excrement might be thrown at women in stocks or pillories, while verbal abuse, insults, and threats added to the public spectacle. This communal participation was not incidental. It was a deliberate means of reinforcing social norms and ensuring that the consequences of adultery were internalized by the entire community. By making the punishment a shared experience, medieval authorities turned the private crime of adultery into a public lesson in obedience, morality, and the maintenance of social order. The symbolic dimension of public shaming and torture cannot be overstated. Women's bodies were treated as canvases upon which the community projected its fears, anxieties, and moral expectations. Punishments were designed to be visible, memorable, and emotionally resonant, ensuring that the consequences of adultery were internalized both by the offender and by the spectators. The combination of physical pain, social humiliation, and moral censure created a layered form of punishment that was as psychological as it was corporeal. The intensity and severity of these punishments varied by social class. Noble women were often subjected to highly ritualized forms of humiliation, such as forced public penance in church or parading through the streets, sometimes under armed guard to prevent retaliation or rescue attempts. Lower-class women faced similar punishments, but often in more brutal, less ceremonial forms, reflecting the harsh realities of peasant life. Despite these differences, the underlying principle remained the same. A woman's infidelity was not merely a private matter, but a violation of communal trust and moral order, demanding punishment that was public, visible, and socially instructive. In some regions, the combination of public shaming and torture escalated to life-threatening extremes. Accused adulteresses could be executed in ways designed to serve as both punishment and warning. Drowning, burning at the stake, or hanging were occasionally employed, especially when the adultery intersected with high political stakes, questions of inheritance, or noble honor. These executions were typically carried out in public squares or at the edges of towns, ensuring that the spectacle could be witnessed by as many people as possible. In such cases, the line between punishment, entertainment, and moral instruction was deliberately blurred, with the offender's suffering serving as a stark reminder of the dangers of transgression. The psychological impact of public shaming and torture was immense. Women were forced to confront not only the physical consequences of their actions, but also the relentless judgment of their communities. The public nature of the punishment amplified feelings of shame, isolation, and powerlessness, creating lasting trauma that could affect social standing, marriage prospects, and personal well-being for the rest of their lives. In a society that valued reputation and honor above individual rights, the psychological toll was often as devastating as the physical punishment. In conclusion, public shaming and torture were central to the enforcement of moral and social norms in medieval Europe. Women accused of adultery were subjected to punishment that was deliberate, visible, and multifaceted, combining physical pain, social humiliation, and moral censure. Stocks, pillories, floggings, processions, and ritual penance all served the dual purpose of punishing the offender and educating the community. These measures reflected a society in which female fidelity was inseparable from family, honor, social stability, and communal morality, and in which the consequences of transgression were designed to be unforgettable. The extreme severity and public nature of these punishments reveal the stark reality of life. For women who violated societal expectations, their suffering was not only legal and physical, but deeply symbolic, leaving a permanent mark on their bodies, minds, and social standing. By understanding the role of public shaming and torture, we can begin to grasp why adultery was treated with such extreme measures and why the punishment of cheating wives in medieval Europe was far more harrowing than most modern observers could imagine. These practices underscore the degree to which women's bodies and behavior were controlled, regulated, and politicized, creating a social order that enforced obedience through fear, spectacle, and pain, while public shaming, corporal punishment, and ritual penance were severe enough to terrorize most women in medieval Europe. Some cases of adultery went far beyond humiliation or temporary suffering. In extreme instances, women accused of infidelity faced punishment so brutal and unforgiving that they serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers of transgressing societal norms. These extreme cases often involve noble families, disputes over inheritance, or situations in which the offense was seen as an existential threat to social or moral order. The combination of legal authority, community enforcement, and religious justification created a climate in which the most severe punishments were not only possible but in some regions expected. One of the harshest forms of punishment for adulterous wives was execution. Methods varied depending on region, social status, and the perceived severity of the offense. Drowning, burning at the stake, and hanging were among the most common, each designed to inflict maximum suffering while simultaneously serving as a public warning. Drowning was sometimes employed in rural communities or towns near rivers and lakes, where a woman could be submerged as a symbolic cleansing of sin. Burning at the stake was more common for high-profile cases, often involving noble women whose adultery was considered a direct threat to dynastic stability. Execution by hanging, while perhaps more familiar in later periods, was also used, particularly when the offense intersected with crimes like treason or violence. The rationale for such extreme measures was both moral and practical. In noble families, a wife's adultery could jeopardize political alliances and raise questions about the legitimacy of heirs, threatening entire estates or dynasties. Punishing the woman with death or permanent mutilation was seen as necessary to protect family honor and ensure the integrity of property inheritance. In lower-class communities, executions were less about dynastic concerns and more about maintaining moral order and deterring others. The spectacle of a woman being executed for adultery sent a clear message. Infidelity would not be tolerated under any circumstances, regardless of social rank. Beyond executions, other extreme punishments combined physical torment with long-term social humiliation. Mutilation was a common tool, particularly for women of lower status. Cutting off ears, noses, or hands marked the offender permanently, ensuring that the consequences of infidelity were visible for the rest of her life. Branding, often with hot irons, left a permanent symbol of shame on the skin, while some women were forced to wear distinctive garments or emblems that advertised their crime to the community. These punishments were intended to degrade, ostracize, and intimidate, creating a lasting deterrent not only for the offender, but for the broader population. Some of the most extreme punishments were ritualized, blending elements of public humiliation, corporal suffering, and moral correction. Women accused of high-profile adultery could be subjected to prolonged public penance, forced to walk barefoot through streets, carry heavy crosses, or attend Mass while confessing their sins aloud. In some cases, these rituals lasted days or weeks, during which the offender endured continuous public scrutiny, abuse, and physical discomfort. These elaborate punishments emphasized the community's role in enforcing morality, ensuring that the consequences of adultery were not merely private but socially instructive. Historical records provide examples that illustrate the terrifying extremes of punishment. In France during the late medieval period, noble women accused of adultery could be imprisoned in remote castles or convents under strict guard, sometimes for life. Their movements, diet, and communication were strictly controlled, and any attempt to challenge the punishment could result in further torture or even execution. In England during the 13th and 14th centuries, women accused of infidelity in cases involving property disputes were occasionally drowned or hanged, often in public spaces, as part of an official sentence designed to preserve family honor. Similar cases across Italy, Germany, and Spain reveal a consistent pattern. When adultery threatened social or familial stability, punishment could be merciless. Even when death was not the prescribed penalty, the consequences of extreme punishment were often permanent. Women who survived mutilation or prolonged torture faced lifelong stigma and social ostracization. Marriage prospects were effectively ruined, economic opportunities were limited, and psychological trauma could last decades. In many ways, the social death that accompanied these punishments was as significant as the physical suffering inflicted. Demonstrating the intertwined nature of legal, moral, and social enforcement in medieval Europe. The Church's role in these extreme cases was both direct and indirect. While ecclesiastical courts rarely carried out executions themselves, they provided moral and legal justification for harsh punishments imposed by secular authorities. Clergy often emphasized the spiritual danger posed by adulterous women, portraying them as threats to the moral well-being of the community. Sermons, confessions, and ecclesiastical trials framed these punishments as necessary acts of divine justice, reinforcing the idea that extreme consequences were not merely human decisions, but expressions of God's will. This religious sanction made harsh punishments socially acceptable, even desirable, and added a spiritual dimension to the terror inflicted. Gender dynamics were particularly pronounced in extreme cases. Men rarely faced the same severity of punishment, regardless of the social or economic consequences of their actions. A male nobleman's affair might be condemned morally or result in financial restitution, but the threat of mutilation or execution was almost never applied. Women, on the other hand, bore disproportionate responsibility for maintaining family honor and social stability, and their transgressions were punished with severity that reflected both patriarchal authority and communal expectations. This disparity underscores the broader gender inequalities of medieval Europe, in which women's bodies and behavior were tightly controlled through law, custom, and religious doctrine. Extreme punishments also served a broader societal function. By making examples of adulterous women, communities reinforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior and maintained social cohesion. Public executions, mutilations, and long-term humiliation were spectacles that reminded the population of the stakes involved in violating moral norms. These punishments communicated that women's fidelity was not a private concern, but a communal responsibility, and that any deviation from accepted behavior would be met with the harshest consequences. In this sense, the extreme cases were not anomalies, but deliberate tools of social regulation. In conclusion, the extreme punishments faced by adulterous wives in medieval Europe illustrate a society in which moral, legal, and social imperatives converged to enforce rigid gender norms. From execution and mutilation to prolonged public humiliation, these punishments were designed to inflict maximum physical, psychological, and social suffering. The stakes were highest for women, whose fidelity was considered essential to family honor, property inheritance, and community stability. These extreme cases reveal the terrifying reality behind medieval attitudes toward adultery, demonstrating that the consequences for women were often far worse than mere legal penalties. They were designed to terrify, degrade, and permanently mark both body and reputation. By examining these extreme cases, we can see the full scope of medieval society's approach to female infidelity. The combination of legal authority, religious justification, community enforcement, and patriarchal control created a system in which women's lives, freedom, and dignity could be destroyed for a single act of transgression. These grim realities set the stage for the central conclusion. What happened to cheating wives in medieval Europe was far worse than modern imagination might allow, revealing a world where fear, punishment, and public spectacle were the tools used to enforce obedience and preserve social order.